The Grand Canyon, carved by the great Colorado River, was made a national park over 60 years ago to preserve its natural grandeur. But today, parts of that canyon are being degraded, not by human activity, but by a domestic animal gone wild. In English, we call it the donkey. In Spanish, it's called the burro, and that's the name that stuck. Today, we have a wild burro problem, not only in the Grand Canyon, but also in many other parts of the American desert. Burros were brought to the desert by prospectors during the last century. Because it originally lived around the desert of North Africa, the burro could tolerate the heat and water scarcity of the American desert. But the Model T Ford made the burro obsolete as a pack animal, and many were released on the desert. Those that found forage and water survived and multiplied so that today there are over 20,000 loose on the American desert. Because the burro is a foreign animal to our deserts, it disrupts the delicate balance that has evolved between the native plants and animals. We're going to look at this damage with the help of scientists who have studied the problems caused by wild burros. We'll get the facts, look at the evidence, and then be able to decide whether the population growth of the burros should be controlled or remain unchecked. The wild burro problem is made more difficult because the domestic donkey has been a tame helper and friend of mankind for thousands of years. So the burro has many defenders who have a strong affection for the animal and want to see it live in the wild. This affection is understandable, but we must also learn to value the survival of the native animals and plants of the desert. We'll begin our tour by going to the bottom of the Grand Canyon, to the inner gorge of the Colorado River. Our meeting place is a roadhead near the east end of Lake Mead. Our guide is Dr. Stephen Carruthers, biologist at the Museum of Northern Arizona in Flagstaff and an authority on the ecology of the Grand Canyon. Our destination is mile 209 in the lower gorge of the Colorado River, about 20 miles upriver. As we fly up the canyon, we notice that the slopes on one side are crisscrossed with a great number of burro trails, and in places are almost denuded of vegetation. The opposite side is free of burros and their trails because the deep and swift-flowing river is a barrier to burro migration. Steve, I'm impressed by this real tight network of trails the burros make here on this slope. Why do they do that?
Well, that's an interesting feature of burro grazing. The steeper the slope, the tighter the compression of trailing. And what it does is it allows the burros to get every last shred of available forage that is on the slope. They simply can reach their head out from one trail, basically almost all the way to the next trail, and they thereby clean the slope of its green forage.
Are there other animals that can use slopes this steep?
Well, certainly other animals can use slopes this steep, but when we get into our heavy impact burrow areas, it's only the donkey that seems to make trailing like this. When we have high density deer and bighorn sheep, their trails are more characterized by a single cut across the landscape rather than the high density of trailing that goes all the way up the slope. Now, as we move down into the lowlands, we're coming to an area in which the donkeys congregate during the heat of the day to escape the sun and to get what forage they can while they're not out in the sunshine. and they affect a tremendous amount of damage as they congregate in the area.
You can see what you mean by areas where they congregate. This looks like a corral in here.
It certainly does, Ike, and you can see one of the really nice examples of how extensive the corralling effect gets is this large wallow area here. The donkeys will come down and take dust baths on these alluvial terraces, and in so doing, they totally destruct a large area of the vegetative cover.
Well, how can anything survive in here?
Not very much can. Our studies have demonstrated that about all that does survive in this area is the donkey. The reason for that is that the donkeys, because of their digestive system, like horses, can withstand a tremendously high content of fiber in their diet. Long after the native animals have failed to be able to exist on the low forage quality that we see here in front of us, a donkey or a horse can continue to thrive.
Steve, there are a lot of broken branches here that look like old damage, but also quite a bit of resprouting and new grass. How do you explain this?
Well, as a matter of fact, Ike, this is the site of one of our biological studies in which we had removed 4 years ago approximately 80% of the population of burros that had inhabited this area.
And how many burros was that?
We knew that there was a herd that ranged in size from 8 to 15 donkeys that would come down every day into this area for the shade and for water and forage that was available to them here. Once we had removed 80% of the population, we removed them approximately 4 years ago, but it was only a matter of 2 years before we could see some striking recovery to the area, and this ground cover that you see here now is a perfect example of that. I would point out that the ground cover that is here now is an exotic grass. That is the only herbaceous cover here on the ground, and this particular species of grass is not a palatable forage species for either burro, bighorn deer, or any of the rodents that occupy the area. We expect in time for some stabilization to reoccur, and the area would eventually be revegetated by the native grasses.
Does anyone know how long it would take to reach that natural condition again?
It's so hard to estimate that. These desert soils are so fragile and so thin in terms of the layer upon which vegetation can grow that it may take as much as 100 years before you could see a natural vegetative cover in here again.
So this recovery we see here today is really rather cosmetic. It's not the natural condition.
That's exactly right. It is more cosmetic than it is functional in terms of the biological organisms, the rodents, the birds, the amphibians, and reptiles. It's virtually useless to those indigenous species.
We next fly directly across the river, a distance of less than a quarter mile.
Well, Ike, here we are on the side of the river that doesn't have burros, and we see a desert community much in the way it should be, much in the way it would be without the grazing of the burros. Nice globe-shaped mesquite, all these native grasses here in front of us, the beautiful cover of moss on the ground. This black crusty substance is a moss that is easily disturbed by the donkey hooves. With no donkeys on this area, we have a representative of a good, ecologically well-balanced desert community.
Steve, what place does the burro have in Grand Canyon?
Unfortunately, the wild burro has no place in the Grand Canyon. They are trespass animals. They were initially released to this area by turn-of-the-century prospectors. Once the mineral exploration had subsided, the area had become a national park, and around 1919, the prospectors had no further use of their domestic livestock, and they simply released them here. The impacts that we have measured here in Grand Canyon National Park are simply a result of the activities of the descendants of these animals that were released by prospectors. They have no natural predators. They have no natural diseases. Their populations remain unchecked, and they're multiplying each day. Each adult donkey consumes about 10 pounds of green forage per day, forage that by congressional mandate belongs to the indigenous species of the area. Wild donkeys in Grand Canyon National Park are simply out of place.
Next, we travel south to Alamo Lake State Park in western Arizona, about 30 miles east of the Colorado River. The Burro Range extends all along the Colorado River for nearly the full length of the state. Our guide now is Dr. Robert Omart, professor of zoology at Arizona State University. He has made extensive studies of the burro problem in western Arizona. Before reaching the lake, we stop to examine a healthy palo verde tree, which is one of the characteristic plants of the Arizona Sonoran Desert. The tree normally grows to a full bushy shape, providing food and shelter for birds and small animals, and also providing the shade needed by young saguaro cactus. As we approach the reservoir, the palo verde trees have a stunted and broken appearance, and many are near death. Bob, why is it the burros would eat a tree like this palo verde? Doesn't look very appetizing.
Well, actually, it's one of the most common species out here in the desert, and burros use it on a seasonal basis, primarily in the summertime after the winter annuals have died back and everything has turned brown. It provides roughage for burros, and it also is probably a very nutritious plant of the plant species that are available. They're green material for photosynthesis in the limbs and along the trunk, and burros eat the green limbs as well as biting off the bark on the trunk of the tree. It also has very small leaves, and so the whole green bark and the limbs are consumed by burros.
How can they do so much damage to it?
Well, this is an interesting part of the behavioral foraging capability of burros. They simply come up to a palo verde tree and grab a large branch, and the palo verde is extremely brittle, and they pull on the tree, and as a result of their pulling force, they break the branch off the tree, and you get large branches broken off like this, where the burro will only eat a portion of it, and then the remainder is left on the ground to die. And so every time a burro eats on a palo verde, he's harvesting more than just the annual production. He's actually harvesting material that was laid down there 4 or 5 or 10 years ago.
How does that affect wildlife?
Well, as you can see from the tree here, there's a tremendous amount of damage by burros in the habitat, and as large trees are killed off, this reduces the foliage profile of the vegetation, which impacts a number of bird species that live in the area. Small mammals are impacted by the fact that the trees are killed. There's no longer seed production or pod production by a number of these trees, and so it reduces their food supply. Bighorn sheep are impacted also by the removal of these tree species. Reptiles are probably impacted as well, but no one really knows for sure how dramatically.
Well, how do the foraging habits of the bighorn sheep compare to the burro?
Well, the desert bighorn sheep utilizes the tip or peripheral portion of the palo verde and browses on the new growth on the tips of the twigs. They don't stand on their hind feet to browse, and they don't pull off large limbs. So they simply take the new growth around the edge of the tree, whereas the burro comes in and pulls off large branches, And as a result of this, the tree, even though it's in the environment, is no longer available for desert bighorn sheep.
How fast are the burro populations expanding in this area?
Well, our data from this area indicates that we're getting somewhere between 20 to 27% colts born per 100 adult burros per year. We don't know what the mortality rate is among the adult burros, but with this type of increase in the population, about every 5 years you'd have a doubling of the burro population in the area.
And if you let this go on for 10 or 20 years, would the burros eventually starve?
Well, if there was no removal of any of the burros in this area, populations would build to such a level that the vegetation such as this tree would be destroyed as far back from the lake as the burros could possibly penetrate, and then starvation in the burro population would be imminent.
We next travel to Death Valley in California. Death Valley. The salt flats bake in the fierce heat of the valley floor. But in the surrounding mountains, numerous small springs and seeps support a rich variety of wildlife, including the desert bighorn sheep. But Death Valley National Monument also has over 2,100 wild burros, which monopolize the precious mountain springs, especially during the hot summer months. We're going to compare two of those springs, one on the west side of the valley in the Panamint Mountains, which has large populations of burros, and the other on the east side of the valley in the Funeral Mountains, where wild burros were removed in the 1940s by National Park Service marksmen. We first visit Willow Spring on the west side, in the southern Panamint Mountains. Our guide this time is Pete Sanchez, resource manager of the National Monument. Pete, we can see at least 50 burros around us here at Willow Spring. You can see how they've eaten all the grasses between the shrubs, and the palatable shrubs are browsed almost down to the ground. Large wallow here, completely devegetated. How far out from the spring does this kind of damage extend?
Well, it's quite extensive for the first mile out, and there's good evidence several miles out from the spring. The greatest damage, of course, occurs right in the center, right at the bullseye of what I'd like to liken this to as an archery target. And of course, there are many other springs in the valley, so we have a series of bullseyes here all through the valley.
Kind of target areas.
Yeah, very much like an archery target, with the greatest damage at the center, that being the spring, and then decreasing amount of loss of vegetation out from that center, yes, right.
Boy, this spring really looks filthy.
Sure does.
If I were a hiker coming in out of the desert to drink here, I don't think I could bring myself to drink. What kind of problems do you have in the monuments with springs foul like this and hikers trying to get water?
Well, you said it right there. No one can drink it without purifying the water. Hikers can't use this water. It's so polluted that even if you purified it, the smell and the color and the taste of the urine and feces would come through. So essentially the backcountry is unavailable to people in the summertime since you can't carry enough water.
How many springs total in the monument are foul like this by wild burros?
Oh, in excess of 170 in the Panamint Mountains. Virtually all the springs in the Panamint Mountains are polluted.
How many burros use this spring?
Oh, I'd say on and off at least 85, 90 burros using this spring. There are other springs in the area. This is one of the larger springs. This puts out probably, I'd say in excess of 50 gallons a day. Other springs put out just a few gallons a day at most during the cool weather, and some dry up completely in the summertime, and the hot weather comes in July.
Well, how many gallons of water a day would, let's say, one burro be drinking in the summer?
In the summertime, up to 5 gallons a day, I would estimate. So a burro might drink a spring dry, and in many places our springs do go dry in the summer, both from evaporation and drinking by burros. Of course, many will drink during the night so that there's adequate flow here, but it's still a bad situation, as you can see.
This is a small spring in the Funeral Mountains on the east side of Death Valley. We've reached it by a difficult 3-mile hike from the nearest road. Water in the spring looks pretty clean and refreshing. Is it safe to drink?
Oh, you bet.
Are there any wildlife up here using this spring?
Here, have some. Oh, yeah, this spring is used by bighorn. There's a herd of at least a dozen bighorn that use this spring. There's another spring several miles to the north and another spring about 8 miles to the south. And if this spring weren't here, it would sever the herd, since bighorn tend not to travel more than 5 miles from water.
Pete, if there are a herd of bighorn sheep using this spring, why is it the vegetation isn't trampled down and the water fouled like we saw with the burros?
Oh, bighorn primarily just come in and drink, move out, head for the cliffs and seek shade. And when hungry, they'll just go out on the hillsides and browse there. They don't socialize around like burros do. Burros tend to congregate and socialize around the springs and consequently trample them.
Do the burros have a place in Death Valley National Monument?
Death Valley is the driest place in North America. Springs are very few, water's the most limiting factor, and there are more thirsty mouths than we can accommodate now.
Most wild burros live in the states of California, Arizona, and Nevada. The largest concentration, with over 10,000 burros, is located along the Colorado River and its tributaries. This population has increased greatly since control measures in Arizona and Nevada were prohibited by federal law in 1971. Another population of about 7,000 lives in the desert mountain ranges west of Death Valley. Here the burros have been long protected by California law, and here the environmental damage is especially severe. The eastern Mojave Desert supports a third group numbering about 2,000 burros. This population is also increasing rapidly and expanding its range into new areas. In all cases, the survival of the native plants and animals is jeopardized by the burro. Good winter rains are all the desert needs to come alive with color in the spring. These coreopsis are a favorite food of the desert tortoise, and unfortunately also a favorite food of the wild burro. The tortoise is especially vulnerable because it obtains much of its water and essential nutrients from these flowers. We'll be discussing these problems today with Dr. Christine Berry, a wildlife biologist from the U.S. Bureau of Land Management and an expert on the desert tortoise and rare plants in the desert. Christine, in what ways are wild burros competing with desert wildlife like the tortoises?
Well, the desert tortoise is an animal of the springtime. It comes out when the wildflowers are blooming, from March through the early part of June, and it feeds almost exclusively on the wildflowers and grasses. At the same time, the burros are feeding on just about the same species, so burros can easily deplete the food of the tortoise. There's a second way. The burros, once they're finished with the annual wildflowers and the wildflowers dry up, turn to eating the shrubs. Now, the tortoises use the shrubs for cover from sun and for places to dig tunnels where they can stay underground during the hot and cold times of year. When the burros eat these shrubs, they deplete them in size, and so the cover of an area can be reduced. As a matter of fact, whole shrubs can disappear. The burros can also cave in these dens and tunnels that the tortoises need for protection from the heat of summer and the cold of winter. The third method of impact is through trampling, because the burros can trample the small tortoises, especially those that are newly hatched and only about the size of a silver dollar. And up until the time they're about 5 to 7 inches in length, they can be easily trampled by the burros.
What condition are desert tortoise populations in today?
Tortoise populations are declining throughout the Southwest. In California alone, burros come into tortoise populations over 20% of the key tortoise areas. They occur together with tortoises in places like Ivanpah Valley, which is next to the California-Nevada border, and the Chemehuevi Valley, which is next to the Colorado River. As burro populations grow and expand, they can certainly jeopardize the existence of the tortoise in these areas.
Although coreopsis are not in danger of extinction, other types of wildflowers in the desert are very rare and are seriously endangered by the wild burros. This is the Panamint daisy, found only in a small area on the west slope of the Panamint Mountains near Death Valley. The large flower heads are a delicacy to the burros. This poses a serious threat to the survival of the Panamint daisy. This is the bear poppy, a rare plant with unusual long hairs on its leaves. It grows only on special limestone soils at several scattered localities in the desert. And it too is threatened as burro populations increase. In the California desert, about 70 rare plant species are potentially threatened by the wild burro. This problem will become more acute as burro populations continue to grow. The burro competes most directly for food and water with the desert bighorn sheep. The bighorn is a shy and sensitive animal that requires an unspoiled environment. And as a result, the bighorn are rapidly disappearing in the areas with burros.
It's just an exciting place to work. The Indian thing that you're interested in, the natural history things that I'm being paid.
Our last discussion is with Richard Weaver of the California Department of Fish and Game, who has spent 30 years documenting this competition between burros and bighorn sheep. Well, Dick, how is it the burros compete with the bighorn?
Well, they compete for food, water, and space. And let's take food. Right here where we are, and there's no burros. Look at the abundance of grass. This is an annual grass. The natives call it 6 weeks grass. Over here, this is a perennial grass, a bunch grass. We call this caída grass. All these bunch grasses are kind of the key to how good a range is or isn't. And in areas where there are lots of burros, this is absolutely absent. And in time, the annual grasses disappear too. Grasses are important for bighorn. Bighorn are primarily a grazer. Secondarily, they're browsers. And they do best in good areas of grass. The other kind of competition I mentioned is competition for water. And that's easy to understand. All the creatures in the desert have to have water. So if the water's in short supply, and it frequently is, they're just small seeps or very small springs. The firstest gets the mostest. It's a burro, and bighorn has to stand back. And one kind of water source we have in the desert that takes a little explanation, I guess. The Mexican word is tanaja, and most Americans call them tanks. But in massive boulder places like this, where there's lots of bare rock, we have these natural stone tanks, potholes, if you will. Well, they store rainwater, and if they're large, and sometimes they are, they store rainwater for long periods of time. But it is stored water, and if the burros get there first, drink their fill, and it's gone, they go to another source of water, Colorado River or one of the larger springs or something. But the bighorn are always in the rough stuff in the mountains where there's lots of steep topography, and they won't go out onto the flats, or they won't go into heavy vegetation like where the salt cedar is along the river.
So what are the effects on the bighorn of this competition?
It has decreased bighorn in both distribution and their abundance. And let me give you some examples on different mountain ranges. In 1946, we had bighorn in the Whipple Mountains. That's near the Colorado River. Today, in diligent and hard search, I cannot find any sign of any resident bighorn in that mountain range. Another example is the Slate Range. Absolutely all bighorn are gone from that area, and it's devastated by burros. Some examples of just reduction. A big mountain mass like the Argus Range has just a very remnant population of 12 or 15 bighorn left, and that's at a number that's frightening. That's hardly enough to perpetuate the species. Some other large mountain ranges that should have several hundred bighorn but don't, as the Inus and the Panamonts, yet these have heavy burro populations. In many areas where there's lots of burros, we've actually seen reductions and in some cases extinction of the bighorn populations. But in areas where we do not have this problem, bighorn are doing quite well. Some places they're actually increasing in numbers.
Life in the desert is at the edge of survival. Native plants and animals are under great stress during the long drought of the summer. When damaged, their rate of recovery is very slow. There is little room in this fragile environment for large foreign animals like the burro. As we have learned, the burro has every advantage over native wildlife. It can tolerate high temperatures and scarcity of water, and it can survive on low-quality forage that other animals will not eat. It is nearly free of disease and parasites, and it can live as long as 35 years. It has no natural predator, and not even the few mountain lions in the desert will attack it. All of this results in a doubling of population every 5 to 7 years. This rapid population growth cannot continue indefinitely. Burro populations must be limited by man, or else the burros will die of starvation after ravaging large parts of the desert. Let's consider what options man has for humanely controlling burro populations. At present, the only method used for burro population reductions is the live capture and adoption program. This corral near Death Valley, California, is used to hold captured burros before they are authorized for adoption. This Adopt a Burro program is operated by the United States Bureau of Land Management. The Adopt a Burro program has become popular with the public, and it's likely that many of the burros on the desert could be removed in this manner. The burros become tame very quickly, and they can make excellent pets for older children. There is a waiting list of applicants who want to adopt burros, and most are adopted within 2 or 3 weeks of capture. The problem with the live capture program is that it has failed to keep pace with the rapid expansion of burro populations. During the last 5 years, there has been an increase of at least 6,000 burros in the American desert. But in the same period, fewer than 2,000 have been removed, mainly from the Alamo Lake area in western Arizona. The large populations in California and Nevada have not been reduced to any significant degree. More could be done. but it will take a substantial increase in government funding. Burro capture is expensive and difficult in most areas, costing between $300 and $1,000 for each animal. The money for an effective live capture program must come from Congress, and Congress will act only if it is convinced of public support. But the live capture program is only part of the answer. For many years, burro populations were controlled partly by shooting. National park personnel and ranchers on public land used this method until 1970. This method was stopped in 1971 when Congress passed the Wild Horse and Burro Act, which permits reduction of burro herds by government riflemen only as a measure of last resort. In practice, shooting rarely has been used because of the emotional volatility of this issue, but it remains the only practical method in rugged terrain where burros cannot be captured. Elimination by expert riflemen actually is a quick and humane method of reduction. People often ask whether burro populations can be limited with birth control measures, such as contraception and sterilization. These are good ideas in theory, but in practice they are too difficult and expensive and do nothing to reduce existing burro herds. We really have only 3 alternatives for population control: live capture and adoption, humane elimination by expert riflemen, or eventual starvation. We face a dilemma. On the one hand, federal law protects the burros from commercial slaughter and inhumane treatment, and that part of the law is being enforced. On the other hand, federal law also says burro populations must be controlled so that the natural environment is not damaged, and that part of the law is not being enforced. The tragedy of this dilemma is that everybody loses, including the burros as they eat their way into starvation. And for every day of indecision, there are more burros and more damages to the native plants and wildlife we all value. We feel this dilemma must be resolved now. It is time to give our federal agencies the support they need to take action. Otherwise, we stand to lose those values of the American land which are our most enduring natural heritage.